My father's family was fairly well off, and he had been a banker in a little town in Oklahoma, and always dressed fairly formal. And I remember he had a Studebaker, what I call with the rumble seat. The trunk opened up, and you got into a seat in the back. He had a tan Studebaker that he drove around to see us, and then they had 6 children, and so he acquired ranches and farms in the Texas Panhandle for each of them when they needed it. And so, in fact, after the Depression in 1933, my father and mother moved to a farm and ranch in Ochiltree County, or Perryton, because we could move in there. There was a deed on it, but it was a big old farmhouse, 2 stories, and it had an outhouse. It didn't have a toilet, but my mother insisted we had a toilet in the house. Had a windmill and a tank on it, and we had water in the house and showered and so forth. But her mother and father grew up in Lawton also, and when I first remember seeing them, they had a dairy on the south side of Lawton, Oklahoma, and they milked quite a few cows and delivered the milk they themselves. And my great-grandmother lived with them. Her name was Minerva Narcissus Rankin, and we called her Minnie the Moocher because Grandma Rankin always carried a kind of a apron around, and she always had little raisins. She was constantly just eating one and then that. But she was a very pleasant lady, and I remember her well. And my mother's family, then both of my grandparents lived and had their 50th wedding anniversary, so they both had a long life. And my grandmother Collins lasted, but she was in bed fast until she was in her late 90s. His name was William Clifton Herndon, and then I'm the junior, but he always went by Cliff and always signed his name W.C. And my mother, I remember her checks and everything, she was always W.C. Herndon. Some of his family called him Blaze. I remember some of his brothers when I was growing up calling him Blaze, but normally that was just a high school name. Elsie Alma Collins. She was very dark complected compared to me, and her hair was very dark and curly. My sister had very dark. My mother was dark complected, Scottish, Irish, more so, and I was more fair. And she didn't have many freckles. I never did freckle too much, but we were careful, even though I got places all over the top of my head for not wearing a hat sometimes, driving a tractor. But the sun was pretty fierce in the Texas Panhandle up there, and the wind was on you normally. My parents met at high school, or earlier at least. They were in high school together, and in their yearbook, which we looked at, which shows them both in there and indicate that they probably would get married. And my father was a football player at Lawton High School, and it said my mother would make a good homemaker. And they met, and their families knew each other. I said the Collins family, which was my mother's, had this dairy, and earlier they had a hotel in Lawton, Oklahoma. They had a good life, and my grandmother was Presbyterian and very religious. When we went there, we went to Sunday school and church every time we turned around, it seemed like. Both of them, my mother and father, each had 5 brothers and sisters, three sisters or 3 brothers. And then 2 of my aunts married brothers, so that made them double cousins. Soon after that, well, of course, my father was in the Army, And my grandfather had bought this land in the Texas Panhandle, and so they soon moved to the Texas Panhandle, where my grandfather had several ranches and farms that he had bought. Perryton is in Ochiltree County. It's in the top counties of Texas. It's 125 miles from Amarillo. There are 2,800 people in it. It has one town in the county, but it's had one high school in the county, and I rode a horse some there once in a while there, because it's dirt roads, and there were no paved roads out there. It was just muddy, and the little school had a tiny barn where you could put your pony. The 2 or 3 people would ride their horses there. It was a 3-room school. 3 teachers taught 11 grades. Room 1 had rows in it. Each row was a grade, grade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth. And then my sister started school, and they decided they needed to move into Perryton rather than have her ride the bus all that way, because it was 20 miles one way. I went to first and second grade in Farnsworth, and then the rest of my schooling was in Perryton. Everybody rides a bus or lives in the little town. It's a very religious town, a lot of churches. I grew up in the Methodist church there, which was a very important part of our life. We always went to Sunday school and church, and then church at night, prayer meeting on Wednesday, choir practice on Thursday. My mother and I and my sister all sang in the choir. The Lutheran church was fairly good size, but the Baptist and Methodist and then the Christian church were the big dominant churches, and the churches were a big part of our life. I was born in a hospital. One thing, my mother had a child before me and Dad who died as a baby about 4 months before I was born, and he would have been about 1.5 years older than me. I have a sister named Ann Herndon Cullen. My sister's 18 months younger than I am. Of course, we grew up in Perryton together, and I always thought I was smarter than she was, but I think we were both about the same. Both made good grades in Perryton High School. And I don't know, she was always around. We were close, but we were not close. You didn't play with your sister or anything. We ran in little different crowds, although it was a tiny high school. But because we both went to the Methodist church, but even there, we seemed like we were always separated by some reason or other. Yes, I remember the Dust Bowl quite a bit, and also we were really pinching pennies. We sold eggs, and we had a separator. We milked cows, and we poured the milk and it separated, and we could sell the cream. So once or twice a week, we would take and sell cream. We had an ice box, and we had to buy a 50 pounds block of ice at the ice factory in Perryton and bring it out and put it in the refrigerator. That was the ice in it. And then it had a drip pan underneath it that you take out and empty the dip pan every once in a while. The house and everything, it was just always that fine dust. You couldn't keep it out. And we sometimes put double windows in, and you just had to be careful about it. My mother was fastidious on the house, and she was always cleaning the house because the dust would just seep in. We had the ranch while I was growing up, and spent a lot of times with my father, and even driving tractors during the harvest time. And I drove a John Deere what they call a Johnny Pop Model D tractor. Our lands were in sections, 640 acres, and you'd lay it off, and you go a mile this way and a half mile back this mile, and you just keep going around and round and round. Of course, the plow was only 10 feet wide, about maybe 12, and so it took a long time to plow up 600 and some odd acres, and the family had about 4,000 acres there. We round up cattle, we did our own branding and castration, and we'd ship them, the calves, and sell them. I showed a calf when I was a 4-H kid at the little county fair, and then we shipped our cattle sometimes to Kansas City to market. We'd take our calves off the cows and ship them to market in Kansas City, where buyers would buy them and take them up to the corn belt in Nebraska and feed them on out. Well, we had 3 or 4 cars of cattle, and with each car you got a pass to ride the cattle car up to Kansas City. You rode the caboose. Well, I wasn't supposed to go unless you were 18. Well, I wasn't 18, but my uncle said he had a pass, and he said, here. He dropped it down in the manure and went like this, gave it back to me, and says, here's your pass. So, but I couldn't get on in Perryton because they knew me. So we went down to about 20 miles and stopped the train, and I got on and showed them my pass. And the trainman knew what was doing, but they let me in there. So that was a good experience for me to ride. I went by myself. And then we had the same buyers up there that they helped me. And I stayed at the Mulebach Hotel, I remember, in Kansas City. Well, I remember graduation very well. I remember a girl sang Amapolo as the soloist. I remember when she sang it, and her name was Ruth Bond. I remember it. And I had 2 girls. We were always vying for who was first and second, and then one boy in our class. We all had straight A's. And Ruth and Jane were the 2 girls, and then Wendell Buckholz, who lived in the country, was a boy who always made great grades. It was just, in my mind at least, there was no question. My parents hadn't been to college, but I knew I was going to go. So I rode the bus down. I'd been to Boise State that summer, and so then I kind of knew how to get there. Anyway, I got on the bus in Perryton, rode to Amarillo, and got on another bus, went on down, and I stayed in the dormitory, where I got a roommate from Pittsburgh, Texas, who I think he might be deceased now, but we kept up with each other. And on Thanksgiving, I went to his home. We hitchhiked from Austin to Pittsburgh, Texas, which is in East Texas. Of course, I was in awe. I went to this dormitory and met this roommate who I had never heard of before, named Dick White. But he was in the same situation. He's from a little bitty town over in East Texas. And so we just buddied up and became good friends, and still are. And then he was going through pledge for fraternities, and I was, and I decided I didn't want to pledge that semester. I was there 1 year, and then the next spring was 43, and I left and went to the Army. Well, everyone was doing it. There's no question about it. One thing I remember, of course, we were all male, and we were all stark naked, lined up to get our shots, and they were giving us shots on both sides. And this one guy in front of me, he kept seeing them giving this needle to everybody. He just keeled over completely, fainted completely from it. You know, you're kind of scared to death. You don't know what's going to happen, and they give you this needle. And of course, they had needles on each side, and this kid just fell over. Yeah, I flew to Boston and then got on a ship. We put in port at Southampton, but we didn't go ashore. We just, of course, the transport ship, a room this size would probably hold 50 people. Our bunk beds were this wide, and they were 5 deep. Then you had little narrow passageways, and then 2 bunk beds and 5 deep. That was our transport over, which was not very pleasant. And we had certain days we could go outside and do exercise outside of the deck, and but it was all right. We had 2 meals a day, and you stood up. They just served them, kind of slopped them on your plate or on a kind of a tin tray, really. On D-Day, well, we were circling out, and so then about a day and a half after, went ashore. We climbed down a rope and walked ashore and water up to here. I was on sort of an advanced type. I was in the 86th Division, the Black Hawk Division. So I was met there, and they assigned a brigadier general, or assigned me to him. He was dumb. He got lost all the time. Well, I was driving, but he was telling me where to drive. I was driving because, I grew up driving truck pickups and so forth like that. And then we got in, and then we got surrounded by the Germans in the Battle of the Bulge, and just kind of snuckered in. And it was very cloudy, and our aircraft couldn't bomb them. It was so cloudy they couldn't see, so we just stayed there a couple of 3 days, and finally I got into Cologne, and the Germans were across the river at Cologne. And I do remember one of the fellows in my just sort of went berserk and shot himself in the foot, and says, "I want to go to the hospital." And I never did see him after that. He was from Paris, Texas, I remember him. And then the Remagen Bridge, they found the Germans were across the river, and they finally discovered this one bridge that the Germans had not blown up. And so they rushed us all up there. It was very close to Cologne, and we ran across. Of course, I was a machine gun platoon sergeant, and they ran us across the river, and then the bridge was blown up. Yeah, we were at Berchtesgaden, and Hitler had his hideout up on the hill, and we were kind of billeted in a girls' school down there in the valley. Technically, Hitler had been in this place, and he had gone back to Berlin and shot himself. And we all sort of knew that the war was over by then. The Germans had not been able to do anything. But I just remember now they sent word down that the war was over, and we stayed there about 4 days before we went back. Then I was shipped to the Philippine Islands from there. But while we were at sea going to the Philippine Islands, we got word that the war was over, and MacArthur had waited ashore and blah, blah, blah. So, but they said, well, go ahead, and so we did what they call mop-up operations in the Philippine Islands, because a lot of the Japanese the Philippines is a bunch of little islands. Mm-hmm. Some of them are just a mile square or something. The Japanese wouldn't give up. One thing, I developed some very good friends, one of whom I have a book, and he's now deceased. He was a Methodist preacher's son from up near Chicago, and he was sort of semi-engaged to a woman, and he wrote all these letters to her, but he said, I'm not telling her anything except good things. I'm not telling her anything about the war. But he put those in a book, and I've got his book over there. He wrote it. His children sent it to me a little later than that. But he came to see me. His name was Scott Westerman. Really, in fact, he said in his book to one of his daughters he was writing, I went to so-and-so with my good friend Bill Herndon. He doesn't curse or chew. Nor curse. Yeah, he didn't. Said I didn't cuss or chew. which I didn't and still don't. So I came back and re-entered the University of Texas at 47 and 8, did the quick system at the university and avoided some of the classes and got into law school and got out of law school in 1950. Anyway, University of Texas, we had a lot of fun. I was very active at the Wesley Foundation. Of course, that's part of the Methodist stuff. So I went over there and was president of Wesley Foundation and got all involved in that. And then played some fraternity finally, and then I was elected to Cowboys. And we had the black hats and shoot the cannons off at the football games. And I met Nona, and I was in the fraternity by this time, and the dean of the School of Arts and Science sort of liked me. He was our school sponsor. He had a small dinner or luncheon one day and invited me and invited Nona, who was in what they call Plan 2, which was this little kind of a special education thing they had. So she was sitting across the aisle from me, or the table, and we talked and talked, and she was all right, but she told one of her friends that she was going to marry me at that time. And so we did the date. She was a Pi Phi there, and we did a lot of dating, and we went skiing together, and I had a good time, and I was successful, and being in the Cowboys, I got to do everything I wanted to do, and I was able to have a car. I bought a car after the war. The dealer said the cars were very hard to get then, and he had a little Plymouth coupe, and he said, "I'm going to let a veteran buy it," which I was, and his family said also. So I think I paid $1,200 for it. It was just a little black coupe, and I used that. Then a couple, 3 years later, I traded and got a Pontiac, I think. But new cars were hard to get. I didn't ever graduate as an undergraduate. I had great grades, and so they let me skip, and I don't have an undergraduate degree, just have a JD. And then I got a master's in law from SMU here at night after I moved to Dallas. Yeah, well, of course, I was a veteran. That helped, and I had very good grades. And so I just said, I'd like to go on into law school. And so they said, I talked to the dean of arts and science where I was. And he said, well, if the law school will do it, I'll recommend it. And they did. A year after I got out of school, I went back to Perryton, and because she still had one more year. So when she graduated, then the next year, we got married in July after she got out of her final year of college. Well, her father was a doctor, and her mother died at childbirth when her younger brother died. And her mother was from an old family. And they were all doctors. And in fact, one of the houses that one of the grandparents lived in, it turned into a boarding house sort of after they moved out. Her family was Wooten family, and a very important family. They had judges in it and doctors and so forth, and she was very well established. Her family was in Austin, and so we had a big wedding at I remember Aunt Ella, which was one of her Wooten aunts, did the flowers for everything, which was magnificent. And she lived in the Driscoll Hotel. Her husband had died, and so she moved out of a big house and had a suite in the Driscoll Hotel where she had her servant lived or stayed with her there, and we'd go up there sometimes, and she would have a tea or a drinks there in the Driscoll Hotel. She was the moneyed person. After the night of the wedding, we flew to New Orleans and spent the night, and then the next day flew on to Havana. And then at Havana, we spent several days, and we went to a place called Veradero Beach, which is a beach in Cuba. Yeah, I was living in Perryton when I got married, and then we moved to Dallas a year and a half later. And Nona tried. First, she had grown up with help and never cooked and anything, and people in Perryton didn't have all that help. But she really tried, I must say. She had never cooked in her life. And I remember one thing, I was coming home for lunch, and she had fixed this stuff. It's kind of a mixture of ground meat and so forth, and we both tasted it, and it wasn't good. And so she said, and so she set it down and set it outside, and we had a dog, a boxer, and the dog went up and crawled all down, and then he turned right around and threw it up. Nona never got over that. But I never planned on practicing law. I was going to go back and be a farmer rancher and a partner with my father, and maybe have a little office, which is what I actually did. But truthfully, I got sort of bored after being in the Army and being to school all those years, just riding around. First, my father wanted me just to ride in a pickup with him most of the time, and just kind of follow him around, because he was right. I think we had a great relationship, and he enjoyed me, I think, and especially after I was gone several years there in the Army and being in the war. He liked me just to be with him for a while, and I decided that, although I was very fond of my father, I decided that I needed to get out of there. But after I made the speech, they offered me a job at the law firm at that time was Turner White Atwood McLean and Francis. They had 17 lawyers in it. It was one of the bigger firms in Dallas at that time. And I came in, and I moved up to about 7 or 8, and I saw I couldn't get past the hierarchy, so I left that law firm and went out on myself about 3 years later, and I finally ended up with a little law firm of about 4 or 5 lawyers. I never did plan on practicing law, but I wanted that education. I just thought that, that was a better education. It's semi-business. The law itself is semi-business. You can make it, which I made it that way, and I had always, in the back of my mind, there was no question that's what I wanted to study at the university. But I never did plan on being a true lawyer. Well, I was in Dallas, and I did a lot of what they call title opinions, a lot of that. And the Murkisons were one of our clients. And when they would want to drill a well, they had to know they got good title. So I would get a stack of abstracts like this, and to see that the people that sold it to them had good title. And so I'd write a title opinion that's saying yes, or I'd write a title opinion that says, well, this probate wasn't done, and this marriage was never divorced, and so we need to do, these are curative matters you have to do to get good title. I did a lot of that in the beginning practice here in Dallas. Blossom was born in Austin, but had lived in, Nona had gone to Austin because she was pregnant and knew it was coming, and Perryton really didn't have good facilities. So she went down and had the baby there. In fact, I flew down, was in the air when it was born, and I got there, she'd already had the baby. And then Wes was born here at Baylor. Good relationship. The two children are just about 18 months apart, so it's worked out well. Well, Wes was always a little rambunctious, but they both went to Highland Park High School, and we lived on Southwestern and then Bryn Bar. And he went to Drake, which was good, and he had a lot of Chicago friends up there, and he joined a fraternity up there. I went up to Drake to see him quite a few times. At that time, getting in the junior league was very big, and Nona's friends from Austin and here made a big deal, and she got into the junior league, which was we had junior league follies, which I was in one year, and now it's not that exclusive at all, but it was only exclusive, very social at that time. And I remember when she got in, there were 23 girls got in it, and it was on the front page of all the pictures on the front page of the Dallas newspaper. I don't remember. By that, we had 2 newspapers in town at that time. I met Lynn at a bar here in Dallas, and we said hello, and I said, well, nice to see you. And I got home. I gave him a note, my call, and he called, and I said hello, and he said, well, can we meet? And I said, well, yeah, come by tomorrow. So he came by the next night, and we met, and decided that we liked each other, and so he had an apartment over here on Northwest Highway to begin with. Then he bought a house over here on the lake, and then finally he moved in with me at my request. And then he worked at Emory Air Freight and its successors, always at the airport. He moved down here he grew up in Oklahoma, near Oklahoma City, and he was transferred down here by the predecessor to Emory Air Freight. And he was working with them, and he developed this cancer, and so he had to retire from the successor to Emory Air Freight. But they were very good, and they continued. They had great medication and everything for him. And we had this lake house, and he loved that, and we built a house together, he and I, on the lake down here, and we enjoyed that. He was a great gardener. He became a master gardener, and took all the tests and knew all the plants and things like that, both vegetable and flowers. He took all these shots for his cancer, and he got up out of the bed. He took it in the belly, and he always just said, "Ooh," and I knew he'd taken his, and he's been gone 10 years. It was a good relationship. He enjoyed, and he had good income. We traveled a lot. We went to Africa together. We went to Europe and South America. Of course, our funnest trip was when we went to South Africa. We flew into Brazil first, and then flew across to South Africa, and went down to the Cape down there by the end of South Africa, and then we went up to Kenya, and then we were on a tour, a little 5-person tour there, and we went to the animal situation. We saw the giraffes. One of our fun things that there's a special giraffe that in this little tourist place, this lady had you're on a platform and you were looking right into the giraffe. And so she put a piece of kind of cube cake in Lynn's mouth, and the giraffe has a long black tongue about like this. He took his tongue around like that and took the piece of cake out of his mouth. And it was kind of fun. Well, I've had a good life, and I've been very blessed, and with children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren, and have a pretty comfortable life financially. It's never been. I inherited some, but also I've always made a good living. Well, I think the young people, need to try to have goals in life, and I had kind of 5-year goals in mind from about the time I got to college on. I wanted to do this, I wanted this degree, I wanted another degree, I wanted a farm place, I wanted to have a ranch, I wanted a house, and to have objects in your life. And if you don't make it, that's fine. During the war, a bunch of us got go back to Paris for 2 days. They put us in the back of a truck. We were standing up in the back of a truck, and they put us in sort of a dormitory type thing right near the marketplace. And it was about 10 o'clock, and we got out and we were talking to people. I said, well, we need something to eat. What can we have in Paris? And they said, well, there's a restaurant open now because it's in the marketplace, and you can go there and get something to eat or something. And the name of the restaurant was A Dog Who Fame, the dog who smokes, and it's still there today. And I've gone back to it many times. It was just an ordinary restaurant, and the farmer's market was about 2 blocks or a block and a half from it. And that part now has all been torn down, and there's a museum close to it. And this is about 2 or 3 blocks from Notre Dame. It's right in the heart of Paris. But I always go back to The Dog Who Smokes. I was there once with my law partner, Carl Abramson, and he was regaling the waiter of how I'd saved Paris and all of that, a lot of bull and so forth. And when our check came, the waiter says, for monsieur who saved Paris, I've given a 1% discount.